So God, even in the midst of Joseph's struggles and challenges, even in the worst circumstances, God is with him. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Renewal Bible in a Year podcast. My name is Pastor PJ, and I am thrilled to be joining you once again as we are in week 2. And before we get into anything, I just want to congratulate you. If you're listening to this, then I'm going to assume that you listened to the first week, that you did the first week of reading, and you're on to week 2. So I just want to congratulate you. A year can feel like a long time, but you're about 2% of the way done. And that might seem small, but just 1 week and 51 to go. So I'm thrilled for you, and I'm excited that we get to continue this journey. As a slight recap, the first week we discussed Genesis 1 through 24, and we had the creation of the world, its fall into sin, we had the flood and the calling of Abraham, ending with the birth of Isaac, and Isaac eventually getting Rebekah, his wife, and continuing this family line. Today, we're going to be talking about Genesis 25 through 45, and this week's readings really lean into this chosen family, that God has picked this family to be the beginning of this wonderful creation, this wonderful promise within this world, that he is going to bring about blessing into this world through this family, and so we're going to be focusing on that family today. And as we're going to see, it is a blessed family. It is a family that is to bless the whole world, and yet it is still a dysfunctional family that has its own share of problems as well. And so we're going to see lots of issues between siblings, between generations, and it's a good reminder again that even the people in the Bible, these historical people, these people of faith, they're also fallible, they're also sinful, and so they have all of their blemishes as well. With that, I want to jump into the readings. So starting off this week, we start with Genesis 25. So we just had Isaac getting his wife Rebekah. And so now Isaac's going to take over center stage as kind of the main patriarch that we're following for a little bit. He's not going to have a long stint here, but he's the one we're going to follow now. So chapter 25, first we have Abraham after his wife Sarah dies. He takes another wife, often a forgotten detail in the Bible, has other children, but they're not the children of promise. They're not the son that was promised by God as part of this covenant. And so he gives them some share of his wealth, but ultimately sends them off. And then Abraham dies. So this is kind of our first main figure that we followed for a while, other than Noah maybe, that has died. I just want to highlight some of the beautiful language that the scripture uses. When Abraham dies, it talks about him being of a good age and that he was full of years. So 175 years, obviously a lot longer than people live today, but I like that phrase full of years. And as we'll see even later in other biblical characters, that phrase full of years or full of days will be frequent for talking about a long life. And I think that's a beautiful way to look at our lives. You think about how long somebody lives, and it's easy to view that number as big or small, long or short, but to view it in terms of how many years is it full of? How many days is it full of? That each day is a blessing in the Lord. So Abraham lives to 175. He is full of years. He dies. He's buried by both his son Isaac and Ishmael, who shows back up. Following Abraham's death, then, you have God blessing Isaac, and now he's going to take over center stage. And one of the first things that we find out is that his wife Rebekah is barren, so she struggles to conceive, and they're hoping for a child. Again, this is a promised family, and we need more generations, and so this is a big thing. We need more generations. We need this family to grow, and so Isaac, his mother Sarah, had the same challenge. Her and Abraham struggled to conceive, and now we have Isaac and Rebekah struggling to conceive. And this is a frequent theme throughout the scriptures, that there's this reality that God is the one who ultimately blesses and grants children. And so for many of these patriarchs and matriarchs, as they seek to expand the family that God is giving them and expand the promise and the command, be fruitful and multiply, that I'm going to make a great nation out of you, that they ultimately only do it by God's grace. And that's true even today, that all children are seen as a gift from God to be received and seen as something that he grants to us, that he gives to us. So Isaac goes to the Lord, he prays on behalf of Rebekah, and then she conceives and she has twins. And we don't know exactly what this looks like, but she can tell that their children are struggling together within her. So I don't know if that was just like some crazy kicks or what, but she can tell that there's something's going on here with these babies. So Rebekah seeks the Lord and inquires of him, and he tells her this prophecy I'm going to read. He says, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. And so he tells her there's 2 children in you, but they're each going to have their own nation. So now think back, we had Ishmael, who is a brother to Isaac, and he's promised now that he's going to multiply. And now we have Isaac having children, and there's 2 of them, and they're wrestling with one another, even in the womb. And there's already this promise that from these 2, they're going to kind of be in strife and conflict with one another, and each one is going to produce its own nation. And so we, as we'll read, those are going to become 2 brothers. And here in chapter 25, they give birth, and the first one comes out, the older, Esau, which his name means red. And so from here on, I'm just going to flag this for you. Esau and Edom are 2 words that are meant to be synonymous. Esau is the name of this man. Edom's another word that's ultimately going to describe his descendants. Just like the second son, Jacob, is going to have his name changed to Israel. So Jacob, Israel, one person, one nation. Esau, Edom, one person, and then eventually one nation. And there's this promise, right, that the older shall serve the younger. So even before they're born, God has made this promise that the younger of these 2 twins is going to be superior in some way, shape, or form, that the older brother is going to serve the younger. We see a little bit of their struggle right away because Esau comes out first, and then we're told that Jacob comes out holding Esau's heel. So he's already kind of nipping at his brother, right? There's already this tension between the 2. And so Jacob's name then comes from this word that means to take by the heel or cheat. And I just want to pause for one moment because, as I already alluded to, Jacob, as we got this promise to Rebekah that the younger brother is the one who will be served, this is the one that the promise is going to continue through, that the lineage is going to go through. His name means to take by the heel or he cheats. And one thing that, again, imperfect people that God uses, Jacob is a really interesting one because flash forward, he's the one whom God's people are going to be named after. As we're going to read this week, his name's going to be changed to Israel, and then that name is going to be the name for the collection of God's people. So they're not going to be Abrahamites, they're not going to be Isaacites, they're going to be Israelites. And so it's really interesting that Jacob is the one that they get named after, and he's kind of this crafty fella. He's not super upright. He does some things well, but he's kind of sneaky. And as we're going to see, his grabbing at his brother's heel, he's also going to be one who's going to be a little deceptive, and then he's going to have all sorts of other challenges. And his descendants are going to wrestle with God as well, and we're going to get to what it means that he wrestles with them. And then personality-wise, you have Esau, who is this hunter. He's this skillsman. He goes out, he hunts game, and his father Isaac loves him for it. And then Jacob is this quieter one. He sits in tents, and his mother loves him. And so again, the dysfunctional family here going on. You have a favorite child for each parent. Not good. And then we see the tension between the 2 brothers already. So as they grow up, there's one day Esau comes back from the field and he's so hungry because he's been out working hard. And Jacob had made this stew, it's red stew. Again, remember that Esau and Edom mean red. And he says, "Oh, give me some of that." And Jacob, in this moment of taking advantage of his brother, says, "Hey, I'll give you some of this stew if you sell me your birthright." So as a firstborn, you have a specific birthright. If you give me that, then I will give you some stew. Now, first off, it's just wild that Jacob would think of this moment to see, hey, what if I give you some soup in order for the right of the firstborn son in the family? That seems like such a silly trade. But what's also really silly is that Esau is so narrow-sighted, so hungry, so blinded by all this that he actually accepts the deal and sells his birthright to his brother and becomes mad at it. So he despises his birthright. It's a problem there. So you have Jacob stealing Esau's birthright in this crazy maneuver. You have Esau not valuing the right of this firstborn son that you should. And so just remember the promise that Rebekah was given, that the older shall serve the younger. You're already seeing this reversal, that the promises that are typically given to an eldest son and the continuation of the family lineage is already being passed over to the younger, this time by Esau's folly. So this is one of the themes you're going to see throughout Scripture, is there's this constant tension between what God is doing and what humans are responsible for. So God foretold Rebekah that the younger would be the one that his favor and promise would continue through, and yet he's getting it through kind of a sneaky method, and we're going to see that even more so in the coming chapters. So I just want to highlight the tension of God's promises and his working through fallible people once again, and sometimes through some not good means. Sometimes people do things they're not supposed to do, and somehow, some way, God uses that for his own purposes. And sometimes we're just left with the tension. But God had made this promise, and we're seeing it start to get fulfilled out. Now, in chapter 26, there's a famine, which is going to be a reoccurring theme in some of these passages. And Isaac is tempted to go to Egypt for food, but God comes to him and tells him, don't go to Egypt, but dwell in this land that I shall tell you, be a sojourner here. And the blessing is passed on to Isaac, continuing to take what was given to Abraham and passed on to the next generation. He says, I will bless you, and to your offspring I will give these lands. So the land you're sojourning in right now, you don't live here, you don't have a permanent establishment, but one day I'll give this to your offspring, and I'll multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven. And so again, we see this covenant, this promise being passed on to the next generation. And then in chapter 26, we have this interesting situation where Isaac encounters Abimelech. So Abimelech means my father is the king. So this is likely a title for this people in this region. If you remember, there was twice where Abraham was in a situation where he was scared for his well-being and told everybody that his wife Sarah was actually his sister. The second of those times came in communication with Abimelech. So again, the king of this area, the one who's kind of the local ruler there. And now Isaac encounters Abimelech and does the same thing to Rebekah. And he says, oh, she's my sister. Now, we have no idea. Did Abraham pull his son aside one time and tell him, hey, did you know that I did this once a couple times, or I told everyone your mom was my sister? Like, we don't know. Is it just a personality thing that like minds think similarly? Who knows? But Isaac does the same thing where he tells everybody that this is my sister so they won't hurt him to take her. And this one, though, as you'll notice, all three stories, twice with Abraham and now once with Isaac, they have a similar pattern where the protagonist tells everybody that his wife is his sister, but all three have played out differently. So once there was a plague on Pharaoh's house. The second time, Abimelech got this dream from God telling him, don't touch this woman. She's already married. And now this time they see Isaac and Rebekah laughing and say, wait a minute, the way you guys are interacting with one another, like clearly not siblings. You're clearly something more. So nevertheless, God intervenes, protects them, and you continue to have God looking over these untrusting people at times and these imperfect people, but taking care of them. And then the chapter closes by telling us that Esau took 2 wives from the area. And if you have been tracking up to this point, there's been a huge emphasis so far on this chosen family and not taking wives from this region. Again, this people, and we'll get to the Canaanites more later, but there's a certain aspect of their wickedness, their practices that are problematic for the working of God's work in this world. And so Esau takes 2 wives from this area and they become problematic to his parents. They do not like these wives. They don't like what he's done. And we're going to see that play out in other ways. Now in chapter 27, you have this, for a lot of us, really well-known story where Jacob steals his brother's blessing. So it comes to a point where Isaac knows that he's towards the end of his life and he decides, I'm going to pass on this blessing, the blessing my father had, the blessing I have. I'm going to give it to Esau, my firstborn son. And he says, you go, Esau, go hunt and make me some food, and then I will give you this blessing. And Rebekah, since her favorite son is Jacob, she pulls Jacob aside and says, hey, I have this plan. Well, your brother is out hunting. I'm going to make some food, and we're going to cover you with goatskin because your brother's really hairy and you're really smooth, and we need to trick your dad, and we'll put some clothes of his on you so you'll smell like him. And Jacob goes in, he brings this food, and he tricks his father, and his father's skeptical, but he can't see very well at this point. And ultimately, Isaac blesses Jacob, and he gives them this blessing that peoples will serve you and nations will bow down to you, and that you will be lord over your brothers, and may your mother's son bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. So notice here, he just gave Jacob this promise that anyone who blesses you will be blessed, and anyone who curses you will be cursed. That's a direct pull from Genesis 12 and the initial promise given to Abraham. Whoever blesses you will be blessed. Whoever curses you will be cursed. So he's giving him Abraham's blessing. And he's also fulfilling the Lord's promise that your brothers will serve you, right? Just as Rebekah was told when the children were in her womb that the younger will be served by the older. This comes about. Again, it comes about by Jacob living up to his name and cheating his brother and lying and deceiving. Esau comes back and says, hey, I'm here, Dad. Isaac immediately realizes what has happened, but he says, no, I've already given the blessing. There's no blessing left for you. I've already passed it on. And so Esau is mad. He wants to kill Jacob because he stole his birthright through the stew. He's now stolen his blessing through this deception. So he wants to kill Jacob. And Rebekah knows this. She overhears Esau. And so she convinces Isaac to send Jacob back to her brother, Jacob's uncle Laban, back in her homeland to find a wife and to be protected. And so Isaac sends him off, and there's a splitting now, a parting that happens. In chapter 28, Isaac sends Jacob off. Esau sees that his parents don't like his wives now. So Esau tries to rectify things by taking another wife from Ishmael's family, which is obviously closely related. And I just want to highlight this right here because one thing you'll notice in Genesis is this attention to preserving the people, the family line. And there's marriages which are quite frankly much closer in relationship than we have today or should have today. And what we'll see, this is even closer than God will institute. So in Genesis, there's a certain emphasis of marrying within the family, which again sounds audacious to us, but we're going to see that once the people grow into the nation of Israel, there's going to be strict commandments not to marry within a certain degree of separation. So within cousins, aunts, uncles. So a lot of the things that we think of today, not marrying somebody too closely related to you, that's going to apply to God's people. But what we see here in Genesis is this prioritization of this blessed family, which we're going to see more broadly in the promotion of marrying within the people of Israel and the encouragement for the people of God to be equally yoked with somebody who shares the same faith, who's part of the same family. And one of the beautiful things is it's not definitive that everything's going to go wrong if you break that. But as we see from Esau, as we're going to see elsewhere in the Bible, when you go outside of that, it usually causes problems. It's much simpler and it's much more the design of God to be yoked equally, to be on the same page, part of the same family of God's people. So you see that in Genesis with really close family ties, but again, that's only for a short period of time. And then once the family grows and expands, then those kind of relationships are going to be ultimately banned by God, not that far into the scriptures. But I want to highlight that because as you're reading this, you have everyone from Abraham and Sarah closely related. You have Isaac and Rebekah closely related. We had Esau taking a cousin from his uncle Ishmael, and we're going to see Jacob ultimately marrying some cousins as well. So I just want to acknowledge that that's going to sound weird to us, and just keep reading and understand that this is for a specific time and place. This is not the way it's supposed to continue. And also, this is a good reminder that Genesis, in a lot of ways, is descriptive. There are prescriptive things about what to do and what not to do, but there's a lot of things that just tell us, here's what happened. Here's what the person did. And sometimes there's not a moral judgment call made in the moment, and yet it's implied by how the story plays out or by laws later given explicitly by God that this was not how it should have been. Real quickly, then you have Jacob. He goes to bed one night on this rock, and he has this dream of these angels going up and down this ladder or staircase to heaven. And so he calls that place Bethel, which means the house of God. And I'll just say this is one of the moments that Jesus will later reference when he says, what if you see angels ascending and descending upon the Son of Man? He's recalling this moment of angels going up and down from heaven to earth. And in this moment, Jacob's given this dream that through his family and through this rock that's there's going to be this bridge, this connection between heaven and earth. And so Jesus is going to recall this later and say, I am that bridge. I am that rock in which heaven and earth are united together. And so you have this dream. Bethel will come back into play later in the stories. Chapter 29, you have Jacob seeing Rachel, his cousin, and he wants to marry her. She's beautiful. And you have Laban, who's this conniving character as well, Jacob's uncle, and you're going to see their wits going back and forth. But long story short, Jacob wants to marry Rachel. He agrees to work for 7 years. Then on his wedding night, he wakes up the next day and realizes that he's been duped and that he accidentally married Leah the night before, the older sister. Not good all around. So you can see all of the problems from Laban, from Jacob. He works another 7 years to marry Rachel because that's the one he wanted to marry. And now he has 2 wives, and that's going to cause all sorts of problems because then what you have is this ongoing baby battle where at this time especially there was so much emphasis on bringing forth children. That was, again, if children are a blessing from God, but not something that one can control. And so you see Rachel and Leah both desiring children, but God sees that Leah is a despised spouse. Jacob wanted Rachel, and so God blesses Leah with children. and she holds it over her sister. She holds contempt for her sister, where Rachel is struggling to conceive. And this is much like we saw with Sarah and we saw with Rebecca. Now we're seeing it with Rachel. And what you get then is this terrible baby battle where Leah has some children, and then you have both Rachel and then Leah giving their maidservants to their husband and saying, here, take her because her children will be like my children, very similar to Hagar and giving birth to Ishmael. Eventually, God does see Rachel in her pain and discouragement and grants her a son who's Joseph, who's going to come into play later. And so you have this kind of ongoing, just all sorts of problems, this strife between sisters, never how it's supposed to be. And yet this is also, once again, God working through people's messes and turning even evil things for good. This is how the family of God's people are starting to grow. Now you have children from Leah, Rachel, from both of their maidservants, and you have all of these sons that are popping up. And we don't quite have the full picture yet, but we have most of these children by the time Joseph is born. Now after this, Jacob's ready to go home. He wants to go back to his homeland. His uncle Laban's trying to trick him, and they have this whole deal about sheep and caring for the sheep and how much you can earn for your wages. And Jacob's doing all this sneaky stuff to try to take care of his flock and not Laban's flock. And he's kind of fair, but he's also sneaky about it. And you see kind of this battle of wits. Well, Laban and the rest of his family don't like Jacob because they realize that God is blessing Jacob and making him fruitful, and their own property and stuff is dwindling. So he fears for his life, and he eventually flees. So he takes his wife and his kids and they run home. Laban eventually catches on to it. He runs up ahead and tries to catch them. He does catch them. But before he does, God comes to Laban in a dream and intercedes on behalf of Jacob and says, do not harm him. Now, one of the things that happens, this weird little scene where Laban says, one of my household gods has been taken, this idol. So this little statue he would have prayed to and revered, it was stolen. And we find out it was stolen by Rachel, and she lies and covers it up. And it just causes this whole problem. So again, you can see like no perfect heroes in this story, but ultimately God intervenes. He protects Jacob and his family. They can continue to go forward. Now in chapter 32, he's approaching Esau. And the last time he saw Esau wanted to kill him. So he's scared. Jacob is worried about how this is going to go. Now, before he can get there, he ends up having this night where this stranger, this angel, ends up wrestling with him, and he realizes that it's actually God, that he is wrestling with God himself. And so God will ultimately touch his hip and put it out of place. And we're told that this is the reason the people of Israel to this day do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because Jacob's hip was thrown out of place by God. So again, there's this explanation of why the people of Israel in Moses' day are practicing what they're practicing. And God changes his name from Jacob to Israel, which means he strives with God. So just as Jacob wrestled with God, his name is now one who embodies what it means to wrestle with God. And I just want to highlight that for God's chosen family, their name means he strives with God. He wrestles with God. And again, so I think as God's people today, if you are a Christian, it's normal to wrestle with God. This doesn't mean putting God to the test, but it means to wrestle with these things and to ask God why at times. And sometimes there's not a clear answer, but it's part of the relationship, right? So if you're wrestling with somebody, you're much closer to a hug than if you were far and distant from them. So it's normal for God's people to wrestle with what is God doing, but ultimately to look at his favor and his blessing. Because even in this moment, Jacob is named, he strives with God, Israel, but with that, he's also given a blessing. Then you have Jacob and Esau reconnecting, and this cool moment where Esau actually shows compassion and just weeps and hugs his brother, even though Jacob was so worried about it all. And then Jacob still does this weird thing where he says, hey, I'll catch up with you, and then flees and runs away again. So you can see Jacob, kind of a weird figure, but you can see the love and the forgiveness of Esau, which is really neat. And then in chapter 34, you have this really sad story about Jacob's daughter Dinah, who is defiled by this man Shechem. And then Shechem wants to marry Dinah, but Jacob's sons are so mad at what happened to their sister that they tell Hamor and Shechem that, hey, here's the deal. You have to be circumcised as well in order for us to give our sister in marriage to you. And they're like, great, let's do it. So all of the men of the people are circumcised, and then when they're sore and recovering, Simeon and Levi go and strike them down. And so a really bizarre story, and it shows kind of the vengeance and wrath of Simeon and Levi. Jacob doesn't seem happy about it. He says, you've made us a stench to this people. But again, just kind of recounting for us kind of the just the depravity of the people in this area and even God's people's imperfection as well. That they, first off, that the sadness that this happened to Jacob's daughter, and then secondly, the just kind of wrathful vengeance of some of his sons. Chapter 35, you have another blessing. It goes back to Bethel, that place where he saw that staircase to heaven. He's given this promise again. He says, be fruitful and multiply, this command. So notice here we have in Genesis and then post-flood, you have this command, be fruitful and multiply. And it's very clearly to populate the earth. But now you have it in terms of God's people multiplying on the face of the earth. So God is creating a blessing for this world, but through this family. And they're supposed to multiply and spread out. New Testament, this is through evangelism primarily. To evangelize, go to the ends of the earth, right? So instead of multiplying physically, now we're multiplying the family of God through proclamation of Jesus' promises. But notice here, you have that creation and post-flood command given again in the context of this covenant relationship. And then you have this reaffirmation of his name, Israel, that he's this one named for wrestling with God. And then you have Rachel, as she's in labor, she's giving birth to her second child. So Joseph, her first child, his name meant to add because she wanted another child. May the Lord add to me another. And Rachel will sadly die in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. And then she will be buried, and the story will continue. But we're told here that her burial place is near Bethlehem, and that spot, Bethlehem, and her burial will both be referenced later in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. This is going to be called back. And so then you have this short aside where you're told that Reuben, the eldest son, lays with Bilhah, his father's concubine. So this is Rachel's maidservant, and it's Leah's eldest son, Reuben, who has slept with her. And so whenever this happens in the scriptures and in this time and place, it's a usurping. To sleep with your father's wife, whether you're related to them or not, is a certain aspect of trying to usurp them, one-up them. And so this is a great sin. And this will be called back again later when Jacob is giving blessings to his sons. And then we're given these names of the 12 sons, and I'm just going to read them real quick. But you have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. You have Joseph and Benjamin. You have Dan and Naphtali. And you have Gad and Asher. And so the important part of these 12 is that the number 12 is important, and these sons are important because as the people of Israel expand into a whole nation, right now they're still kind of like an extended family. When they get into a large nation, they will be grouped by these tribes. These 12 different sons of Israel now become the 12 tribes of the nation Israel. So that's why they're key and they're important. And like we talked about last episode with families and not deterministic, but the influence of relationships, the fate of Judah and the fate of Levi and the fate of Reuben and all of these things are going to have ripple effects for their descendants and the tribes that come from them. In chapter 36, we're given the lineage of Esau. Again, that's Edom. And I just want to highlight, when you think of Esau, this wrestling brother, and the name Edom, which will be the name of the nation, which the nation of Israel will wrestle with at times, sometimes working with like good brothers, sometimes clashing with like brothers who are fighting. And then they are known for this mountain called Mount Seir. And so Mount Seir, Edom, and Esau, I want you to try and link those in your head as much as possible. And we're given kind of this lineage and this breakdown. We're told that they have kings, and this is long before Israel will have a king. But it's important to note because Israel originally does not have kings, but they want kings because all the nations around them do. Edom is one of those nations that has kings ahead of them, and so on. Chapter 37, we move from Jacob as the primary focus point to Joseph. And so Joseph, again, is the son from Rachel. And this is the wife that Jacob loved the most, who is now deceased. And so Joseph has this special place in his father's heart. And Jacob chooses Joseph as this favorite son. He gives him this multicolored coat and just clearly loves him more than his other children. Joseph then gets these dreams that he's going to have his brothers bow down to him, as both as grain and then as stars, and even his parents are going to bow down to him. And so he's given these dreams. And something about the words and the manner he shared it and the fact that he's already the favorite, his brothers do not love this. And so what you have happen is Joseph goes out looking for his brothers, and in this kind of fit of fury, they think they're going to kill him. They throw him into a well. Then they decide that they could sell him, make some money, and just pretend and fake his death. And so that's what they do. They sell him off to some traders who ultimately sell him down to Egypt. They go back to their father and bring his multicolored cloak soaked in animal blood, and they say, hey, is this Joseph's? And Jacob believes that he has lost his favorite son, and he's greatly dismayed. And as one can imagine, the sadness one would have for losing a son, you're also all the more on display how much he loved this son over all the others, and so the problems with that. Chapter 38, you have this really interesting story about Judah and his 3 sons, and his eldest son marries this woman named Tamar, and then he dies because he is wicked, and then his next son is supposed to fulfill the duty that was given at this time, where you would procreate with your brother's wife in order to give him a son. So this son will be considered his son because he was not able to bear a son before he died. But this brother doesn't want to do that, so he doesn't go through with that. And then because of that, God strikes him down. So God has stricken down 2 of Judah's sons for their wickedness, their disobedience, and evil intent. And then Judah is so worried that the problem is with Tamar, who's completely innocent in all of this. Judah withholds his youngest son, and then Tamar eventually realizes that he's grown, and so she tricks him by dressing like a prostitute, and Judah sees her, and things happen. And ultimately, Tamar has proved more righteousness because she was the victim in all of this. And again, that's not to say that everything she did was absolutely right or what you should do, right? This is descriptive, but ultimately we're going to have from Tamar and her lineage, then we're going to have the tribe and the people that leads to David and leads to Jesus. So again, just notice through all of this mess, God continues to work to preserve and to bring about his promises and kind of the more wild stories. So now Joseph is in Egypt and he's working for this man named Potiphar. He was sold there as a slave and he's working in it. And you have this theme throughout the scriptures that where God's people are, they're supposed to be a blessing to those around them, and often are, right? So think back to Abraham's promise, in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So God, even in the midst of Joseph's struggles and challenges, even in the worst circumstances, God is with him. It's repeated over and over again. And so God is with him and actually helps him succeed in his care for Potiphar's household, so much so that Potiphar entrusts pretty much everything to him, and things are going really well for them. But then Potiphar's wife lusts after Joseph and tries to convince him to sleep with her. Now, Joseph is righteous and doesn't do so, but eventually Potiphar frames Joseph for trying to assault her, and he's thrown into jail. And then we're told, even in jail, the Lord was with him. Right? The Lord continues to look after him, and he has favor there, and the jail keepers are favorable towards him, and he kind of rises up in responsibility even while in jail. And then you have these 2 people who are in jail who used to work for Pharaoh, this cupbearer and this baker, and they both have dreams one night. And Joseph is given this wisdom from God to interpret these dreams. And so he tells the cupbearer that you will be restored to your place in 3 days on the Pharaoh's birthday, but for the baker that ultimately you're going to be executed. And he tells the cupbearer, when you're reestablished, remember me and tell Pharaoh about me. And 3 days later, it comes to pass that both dreams come true. The cupbearer is reestablished and the baker is executed. But the cupbearer, in all of his joy, yes, I'm free of jail, I'm back with Pharaoh, he forgets about Joseph. And Joseph spends another 2 years in jail just waiting until Pharaoh has some dreams. And Pharaoh dreams about these crops and these cows, and you have these luscious, healthy ones first, 7 of them, and then they're consumed by 7 skinny cows or 7 sickly plants, and he's troubled by these dreams. And then the cupbearer goes, oh my gosh, that's right. There's this guy who interpreted my dream and it came true and I was supposed to remember him. So he tells Pharaoh, I know this man who can help you. So Joseph is called to Pharaoh. Joseph says, the Lord can interpret your dream. And he interprets it for Pharaoh and tells him that there's going to be 7 years of plenty in the land and then 7 years of famine, and that you should prepare for it. So store up grain and such in these plenty years so that you can survive the famine. And Pharaoh, because of the wisdom that God has granted Joseph, because of this interpretation, Pharaoh ultimately establishes Joseph as kind of his second in command, his right-hand man to oversee all of this. And so Joseph then oversees this taking care of the grain and food and preserving it for the years ahead. And again, we see that Egypt flourishes. So notice here again, God's people, or one of God's persons, servants, helping to bless another place because he works and dwells there because of God's faithfulness to him. So Joseph is over this. He helps store up the food. When the famine hits, then people need food and they come to Egypt because they have food there. And so even Egyptian citizens, they sell their land, they sell some of their assets. And so he makes Pharaoh's household wealthy, but he also continues to take care of the whole people of Egypt. And he preserves and provides for people of other nations, because now you have people like Joseph's family who are struggling with the famine, who have no food, who are coming to Egypt to get food because they can't find it back home. And then you have these interactions where Joseph's brothers are coming down and they don't recognize him because for their intents and purposes, he's gone. He's dead. We're never going to see him again. but he recognizes them. And so you have kind of this weird deceptive thing where Joseph doesn't let on who he is, and he kind of toys with them. He sends them some food, but plants their money back. He's showing them favor, but then also when they come back, he kind of frames them and tells them you have to bring your other brother, Benjamin. And Jacob doesn't want that to happen, but eventually he does. But then Joseph frames them. And you have kind of all of this crazy shenanigans going on. So you have Joseph in one sense, ultimately being forgiving, but in a kind of a weird way. Again, probably more descriptive than prescriptive. I don't think if somebody sins against you, you shouldn't trick them and mess with them like Joseph does. But ultimately, you have this really cool interaction when basically Joseph tells his brothers, again, they don't know it's him, that he now has to keep Benjamin. And Benjamin is the only other son of Rachel, who Jacob loved dearly. And so Jacob had said, if you take Benjamin with you and you don't bring him back, then there's no way I can go on living, which again is problematic for a variety of reasons in comparison to how he treats his other sons. But basically, Reuben says, no, I would give up my sons to make sure that Benjamin comes back. We'll do it. And then you have Joseph framing his brothers and saying, hey, I have to take Benjamin now. He's coming back with me. And you have Judah offering himself as take me instead, right? Take me and not Benjamin, which is really cool because if you remember, if you caught this, when they sold Joseph, it was Judah's idea to sell him. So notice how Judah was the one who sold his brother, but now he's willing to sell himself in order to save a brother. And so kind of a cool arc that's going on there. Ultimately, Joseph eventually reveals himself and tells his brothers, go to my father, bring him down, and so he might see me. And Jacob says, all I need left in life is basically to go and see my son. He can't believe it. And so Joseph's going to bring his family to Egypt to take care of them. Again, this was a promise given to Abraham that one day his descendants would be down in Egypt for some generations. So we're seeing that continue to play out. And it's setting the stage for the final chapters of Genesis into the book of Exodus, where getting out of Egypt is going to be the main challenge. So in chapters 25 through 45, you have this continuing of God's family, his chosen people, this choosing of this younger son, Jacob, through all of his kind of conniving. You have this working through Joseph, even though he goes through hardship and struggles, God continues to be with him. And now God is preserving and providing for his people. Even in the midst of famine, he has provided them a spot in Egypt that he's going to take care of them and help them grow until they're ready to head back to receive that land that God has promised them all the way back with Abraham. I want to close out by answering a couple questions that came in from previous readings. The first question deals with ribs, and the question was whether when God creates Eve out of Adam's rib, he takes a rib out of Adam, creates Eve with it, is that saying that men and women have a different number of ribs? Which is an interesting question, and it's one of those that I think does float around even some Christian circles, that men and women have a different number of ribs. And this is where, again, we have to kind of always wrestle with what's prescriptive and descriptive. But in this case, there's no clear instruction saying that from here on, all men are going to have a different number of ribs, but rather in this specific instance, God created Eve in a particular way. Notice how no other woman and no other man are ever made in that exact same manner ever again. Every other man or woman are born what we would call naturally, right? Through normal means, other than Jesus, who is conceived by the Holy Spirit. But even then, he's conceived in Mary's womb and then born what we would call naturally. So that passage about Adam and Eve is particular to them. I mean, you could ask a similar question about whether Adam and Eve had belly buttons because they never had an umbilical cord. And so we're not really sure. That's a good question. But regardless, this passage is not saying that men have a different number of ribs than women. I think sometimes that can be a stumbling block if people hold that or think that, and then they discover that that's not the case. But that is a particular account of Adam and Eve, not a prescriptive for how men and women are going to be anatomically structured from then on. The other question is pertaining Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son, to Hagar, and the great nation that was promised to him in Genesis 21, verse 18, where the Lord promises to make a great nation out of Ishmael. The first thing I'll say is whenever you get a word like great, you always have to wrestle with or try and ask, what kind of great does this mean? We hear great as in like awesome or good, but great also can mean size, like they were a great number, and that seems to be what's included here, that there's going to be a large nation that comes out of Ishmael. And you actually see this in Genesis chapter 25, which is part of our reading for this week. is that you see this fulfillment where all of a sudden you have these 12 tribes of Ishmael that come about. He has 12 sons, they're 12 princes, and they create the people that biblically we see track into modern Arabia. And so you have that people, and Arab even means really nomad originally, but that area of Arabia is kind of helped populated, or at least heavily influenced by Ishmaelites, the children of Ishmael. And so you see this promise to Abraham that God will make a great nation of him. And ultimately, he's going to do that through Isaac. But when Ishmael enters the picture, God looks out for him and looks out for Hagar, and in a way continues that blessing too in a different way. Now, God's chosen people are still going to come through Isaac, and Jesus is still going to come through Isaac. And so that's crucial to remember. But God in his faithfulness does provide a nation out of Ishmael. So you have Ishmael, who now has a nation of his own, but he's settling, it says he settles against his relatives, against his family, against his brothers. So he's now settled in opposition, in a certain sense, to Isaac's lineage. And so there's now kind of a rivalry. And so they're not going to play a huge role throughout all the scriptures per se, but they are another people that are here now, that they come from Abraham, although they're not the people of the promise. Paul will actually use Isaac and Ishmael as metaphors for being a people of slavery versus people of a promise and children of a promise. And so that's just a flag. Now, interestingly, because Ishmael's descendants populate Arabia and help populate Arabia, you actually have in the Quran where Muhammad will be connected to Ishmael, that he is this connection point. So the modern Jewish people, and ultimately Jesus, and therefore out of Jesus, modern Christians and their faith is going to come through Isaac. But you have the Quran connecting Ishmael to Muhammad. And whether or not there's a direct link, nevertheless, there's a good likelihood that much of Arabia and much of the Arab people tie back genetically in some way, shape, or form to Ishmael. So really interesting fact there. But the big thing for now is just to note that God in his faithfulness promised Abraham a nation and makes a nation out of Ishmael. Great meaning large, and we see that fulfilled with the 12 sons. That's all I have for you today. I wish you the best on your reading, and as always, may the word of Jesus renew you day by day until life everlasting. Blessed reading.